Hello and welcome to the Cult Vault podcast, your dedicated podcast for uncovering the darkest corners of cults and coercive control. I'm your host, Casey, and I want to start by thanking each and every one of you for tuning in. Your support fuels our deep dives into these critical issues. Before we get started, a word of caution. Today's episode may contain discussions on abuse, including graphic descriptions of abuse, and covers a variety of human rights violations that may be triggering for some listeners. Please consider this as a trigger warning and proceed with caution. I'm thrilled to announce that I'll be appearing at CrimeCon UK in London on the 7th and 8th of June 2025, and again in Manchester on the 27th of September 2025. Join me and a host of world-leading experts, advocates and noisemakers at the heart of the true crime community. This is the UK's biggest true crime event, and you won't want to miss it. Use the code CULT, C-U-L-T, for 10% off your tickets. And remember, there are flexible tickets and payment plans available to accommodate everyone. This incredible event is sponsored by True Crime, and it's always my favourite weekend of the year. I hope to see some of you there. And for those who want even more from the Cult Vault podcast, you can access early, ad-free content by supporting me at patreon.com/thecultvault, where every pledge not only gives you exclusive access, but also directly supports the continuation of this work. Thank you again for your support and your listenership. Now, let's unlock the vault. Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of the Cult Vault podcast. I am your host, Casey, and today I am joined by a guest that is working in the field in a very important capacity, but slightly different to what we typically talk about on the podcast. I'm so happy to welcome Anna. Hi, Anna. Welcome to the show.
Good morning, Casey. Thank you so much for having me.
I usually start by asking every guest to introduce themselves to the listeners.
Sure, I'd be happy to. My name is Anna Sonoda, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker in the United States. I reside in Atlanta, Georgia, and what I spend my time focusing on is educating adults and older teens and middle school, junior high age children about grooming. And grooming is the precursor to 90% of all child sexual abuse. And I believe that if we educated adults about how to recognize grooming, we could eliminate the majority of child sexual abuse that occurs in this country and in yours.
50% is a scary statistic. Logically, I suppose it makes sense. But to think that there is almost a preventative step before exploitation, it's kind of scary to think about in that way. When you talk about being a licensed social worker, how did you get into that line of work? Was it something you always wanted to do, or did you fall into it by accident?
So when I was getting my master's in social work, I really wanted to work with couples and do conflict resolution in the form of marital therapy. And what I had the opportunity to do during my training and during my education was to have a practicum, which is an internship within a clinical setting. And one of my options was working with convicted sexual offenders in a cognitive behavioral treatment center. And while all my friends were running the opposite direction, I decided that it would be very valuable to understand sexual distortions and perversions if I'm going to work with couples. Because if I understood that the pendulum swung all the way to that side, that dealing with your average married couple would be a bit more predictable. So I decided to embark on this year of working with convicted sex offenders. I had the opportunity to counsel individuals, couples when they had partners or spouses, and then doing weekly group therapy. And I stayed on after I had graduated for several years because I really found it impactful work and important work. I thought of it as a community service in a way, because if I could help educate these individuals to prevent them from harming children or families, then that was a service. What I quickly learned after I had my own family was that most adults don't recognize that grooming is intentional and selective and observable. So if we only know what to look for, we can actually interrupt the grooming process. And that clinical experience really informed and impacted the decisions I make as a parent today.
Is it uncomfortable speaking to people that have this, I don't know what you would even call it, like these, I don't want to say condition, I don't know if that's the right term. Is there a term that you would use that you think is appropriate?
Well, this gets really murky, Casey. It gets pretty interesting. And actually, there's a movement within the treatment of sexual offenders to refer to these individuals as MAPs, or minor attracted persons. I think there's a lot of potential damage if we go that route. There is no such thing as being minor attracted, because children are always off limits sexually. Everyone needs to be in a relationship, ideally, that is balanced with someone who has the ability to consent. And that doesn't come online in the state I'm living in until age 16. So attracted or not is really irrelevant to what we need to be training, not only adults, but young adolescents. We see a growing trend of adolescents sexually acting out on other children. And this is completely unacceptable. Not only is it unacceptable for the children they harm, but for those adolescents themselves who may have other factors going on in their home life, or something that has maybe happened to them, or something they've been exposed to. So when we talk about this, we can really say people who have acted out against minors, or people who have sexually harmed minors, because that's the accurate term. Really, whether somebody is labeled as a pedophile or somebody who got under the influence of substances and acted out against a child, that is the most important thing we need to focus on, is protecting victims and understanding that victims are never, ever, ever to blame in situations where an adult or an older teen has acted out sexually against them.
It's kind of reminding me of the book Mindhunter, where the special elite unit within the FBI would sit down and speak with serial killers to learn about how serial killers think and function, because it's so outside of what I suppose typical people could ever comprehend or understand. And you've done sort of the same process of sitting down with people and asking, I guess, their thought processes and their motivations and their impulses.
Exactly. So cognitive behavioral therapy, for anyone listening who may be unfamiliar with that term, is the process by which we as therapists evaluate belief systems that impact thoughts that then impact behaviors. So we're really unpacking, what is it about the child that you harmed, or children in general? What is your belief system about that? Oh, well, I believe that a child deserves love, and I'm the person to give them love and affection. And so my thought was, I'm doing this child a service by showing them attention and affection that wasn't coming to them from family members or other individuals in their lives. Therefore, my thought kicked my actions into these sexual behaviors with a child. So then we can unpack that and say, well, your belief was incorrect, or your thought was incorrect, and your actions were absolutely incorrect. But then working that backwards so that we can change the belief system, therefore making them safer individuals as they go out into the community. Everyone that I counseled had already served their time within the prison system and was being brought back into the community. And that's a really important part of our discussion today, is that the majority of individuals, if they do serve time, will be at some point reintegrated into the community. So it behooves us not only to understand them, but to figure out, more importantly, how do they prey on families and children, because we're not going to be able to undo their mental beliefs or their thoughts. We can sometimes intervene in their behaviors, but our job and responsibility as caring adults, or adults who work closely with children, is to be able to recognize that grooming process so that they don't have an opportunity to reoffend. And in this country, the recidivism rate for sexual offenders who get reintegrated into the community is around 20%. And Casey, I know you and I can agree that 20% is far too high for individuals who have already victimized somebody and are being reintegrated into the community.
Well, this has my stomach in knots, this conversation. It's before we started recording today, we talked a lot about how grooming and child exploitation is very rife in a lot of the cultic and group environments, and survivors speak on the show to that all of the time. I myself have never been in a cult, so I don't understand sexual exploitation from that perspective. I have been a child, and I have had my own experiences, which I don't typically mention on the podcast, but I also have my own children who are 3 and 4. So my brain is always telling me that something horrible is going to happen to my children. My first fear is that it's going to be when they're in school with, bullies or predators in the teaching staff or older children. And I try and shut off that part of my brain, but it's impossible. And when I have these conversations with people, it feels like this is everywhere. It feels like it's inescapable and it's inevitable. And I don't know how to cope with it. How do you take care of yourself when you're doing this work? Because it feels overwhelming sometimes.
Well, let me assure you that hopefully after our conversation today, you will feel less of those destructive emotions, because actually what I have discovered is that grooming process, because it is so intentional and selective, not every child is groomed, and not every child who is initially groomed by a potential predator ends in child sexual abuse, because it is a ramp-up process. Child sexual abuse is not lightning. It does not come out of nowhere. There is a clear selection process. And I think that's an important thing to note. When, for example, I'm a mom of 5 kids who range in age from 5 to 15. And today, for example, I'm having to rely on other adults and other caring individuals to make sure that my kids have a wonderful day at school. So I need to do my work, which means I have to do things like evaluate the environments that my children go to. Are there policies in place to protect not only the children who work there, but the reputations and the character of the individuals who work there? Are there security measures? What are they doing to protect empty, unused spaces, for example? Is there any sort of educational program required for individuals who work at that school or that play school? Are there background checks that are done? Are there reference checks that are done? Too often we sort of assume that if a building has a sign up front that it must automatically be safe for our children. And it's on us as caring parents to do our due diligence and research those places and have those conversations. And I'm always shocked when communities I speak with or agencies I speak with say, no, we don't need to worry about having a training for child sexual abuse. That wouldn't happen in our environment. That automatically, for me, puts up a really big red flag, because communities and families that talk about the potential risk of child sexual abuse have less child sexual abuse than those communities who say that it couldn't possibly happen to them.
Yeah, that's kind of when somebody says that they would never join a cult, I'm always like, okay, so that actually probably makes you more vulnerable because you don't think that you are vulnerable. So you'll be less likely to bother looking for the signs or want to educate yourself on how to stay safe from that type of I wouldn't say grooming, but kind of similar to that. When you brush up against a con artist in adult life?
I think you bring up a really good point, which is vulnerability. And I know there's been a lot of talk around vulnerability, and we all need to embrace it and run headlong into our vulnerability. And I can tell you, sitting in the room with individuals who have selected children and families to target, that they are very perceptive about a family's vulnerability. That vulnerability might be financial, it might be emotional, it might be that there's a chronically ill child in the family, it might be that mom and dad are splitting up, it might be that mom is a single parent and there's nobody else who she can lean on, and so she ends up relying on a boyfriend. So what we have to assess as caring adults is, what are our vulnerabilities? What could be perceived as a vulnerability? And in the world that we are raising children in, sometimes it's just as simple as not creating time to give our full attention to our children. Maybe we're doing 20 things and they come in the car and, we're sort of saying, well, strap in and, we've got, 2 other places we have to go to today. Instead of saying, I'm going to shut off the music, I'm going to put down my phone, I'm going to end this conversation, because the best protective measure for children to avoid child sexual abuse and grooming is a key relationship with a caregiver whom they live with.
You first started communicating a few weeks ago, you emailed me about your book that was published in October 2022 called Duck Groom. And immediately I was like, that is such a fantastic name for a book on this subject, because my 4-year-old the day before had come home and told me that he's just learned how to play Duck Goose. And he was really sad about it because he didn't get to play goose. So no one picked him to be the goose. And he said he was really sad about that. But I think it shows that immediately it's about children. Immediately it's about the grooming of children. And now talking to you, when you say that grooming is almost always selective, that kind of adds an even deeper layer to the title Duck Groom. So for the sake of the listeners who may not have heard of your book, can you talk us through what motivated you to write this book and what the kind of key teaching points or themes are within Duck Groom?
Absolutely. So I had this amazing clinical experience with the direct inside the room sex offender conversations. And then I had the opportunity to grow my family and start raising my kids. And I would find again and again and again that I would have chats at the playground or chats over coffee with other parents, and they would say and propagate myths about child sexual abuse. And they didn't quite understand what I came to understand clinically about potential sex offenders and potential predators, that it's not the creepy van with no windows. It is not the individual who's in the grocery store. It's somebody that we have typically known and trusted and that we bring into the lives of our children. And again, I kept facing this reality that, well, I've got 5 children. At the time, my 5th child was turning about 6 months. And I thought, okay, well, if I can't be everywhere to get this message out there, why don't I begin writing? And I hired a developmental editor to facilitate my homework assignments and writing assignments. And it took me a good 3 years to get the book done, obviously with also raising my family. But the charge that I had at that time on my heart was, this could be so much simpler, because the way that we're explaining grooming right now just adds confusion and panic. And panicked parents, paranoid parents, are not effective prepared parents. They're scared, and they're more they're more likely to bury their heads in the sand and say, no, this isn't my issue. That's somebody else's issue. So some of the themes in the book, it's broken up into 3 parts. explains the grooming process. It also explains how different access roles like titles or jobs give our children potential exposure to potential predators. So medical settings, religious settings, sports settings, online settings, environments with peers. I talk about females as well, because that's an underreported group of potential sexual predators. And then in the last part, we talk about what families can do in really concrete terms, and then what communities can do in concrete terms to be less risky when it comes to being an environment that is suitable for a potential predator. Because again, just in the way that we've already discussed, it's a selective process. I'm selecting a team to potentially groom. I'm selecting a school to potentially work within so that I can bolster my level of confidence and charm and goodwill to other adults so that when something happens, I have their backing. I have the people who say, no, it couldn't possibly have been him. He's so kind. He's so generous. He's so great with the kids. So I think that for the purposes of the book, my real intention was, how do we change the discussion about child sexual abuse by 180 degrees? How can we bring parents out of a state of paranoia and fear and into a state of preparedness? And this book is really about getting into an offensive position, if that makes sense, and saying we're not going to wait for something to happen and repair. We're going to go after it. We're going to go down the field, and we're going to not even let certain relationships cross certain barriers because we know what to look for.
Everything you just described there about the kind of school and teacher scenario could absolutely be describing a cult. Just to pick some infamous ones, for example, Jim Jones and the People's Temple, David Koresh and the Branch Davidians, both known for their sexual exploits, assaults, rape. David Koresh specifically, did target children. Very isolated environments, one in a compound that was sealed off from the world, and one in South America away from everybody and everything in the middle of the jungle. So, when you talk about how people say, oh, he's infallible, he could never, he's the best person, he's God, or, however different groups describe the person that is being questioned, maybe with not so much reverence in school spaces as you would find in some of these groups, but it's such a familiar thing that you've just described. It's really, it's interesting to me, but infuriating to me that there are all these parallels and there aren't more of these conversations. I don't know why we're not all connecting the dots, or why the dots haven't been connected like decades ago. I'm sure it has something to do with living in the new digital technological age, but I'll put my soapbox away. Otherwise, listeners know I'll just keep talking about this all day.
Well, something that I talk about nonstop when I talk to families or agencies or groups is the fact that predators run on gas: grooming, access, and space. And at the intersection of all three of those is where child sexual abuse occurs. So even if you recognize that grooming is occurring in your own family or in your own setting, for example, a potential predator must have access to that child and available space. Most child sexual abuse is not going to happen in a public space with potential onlookers. And in fact, 82% of all child sexual abuse occurs in only 2 locations. Do you want to take a guess, Casey, at what those 2 locations are? Put you on the spot.
School?
Say it again.
The school?
Home of the child and the home of the predator.
Oh, okay.
So when we think about schools, you're right in that schools link individuals. They give access. Going back to that gas reference, they provide access, but they don't always provide space, because schools can often be a good example of mandated reporters, people who are legally bound to report grooming or child sexual abuse environments where there are often multiple adults in an environment or a setting with children, possibly two teachers in a classroom, many cameras. Many schools now have cameras. So those are not ideal spaces. If I'm a potential predator, I'm not going to select that as the space where I abuse a child, but I will use that access and my grooming to build enough trust so that I can get the child off campus and into my car, to my home, or to the child's home. Does that make sense?
It does. I was born in the 90s, and I remember in the early 2000s, the school that I was in introduced a new policy where you weren't allowed to be in a room alone with an adult with the door closed. So it was like a really big change in the school, because the teacher would be like, I need to see you after class. And you'd be like, okay, to talk about a homework assignment. Or if a teacher picked up on you being kind of like low or in a different type of temperament than usual, and then they'd be like, oh, can you just go open the door? So you'd be like, oh, okay. So then you'd open the door and then just kind of turn around. And it was really bizarre. And obviously as children didn't really understand why. But I see exactly what you're saying now, just putting in different measures and things to make school an environment where it's more difficult for predators to groom.
And that's why we must have educational programs for staff working in schools. Not because every person who goes into a school to teach or to work or to do the hygiene within the school. No, actually, I need those individuals. You need those individuals to know what grooming looks like, so that as soon as they start to see signs of grooming, they can intervene and interrupt the process. One of the ways that I like to explain grooming to people, especially who maybe have never heard the term before, are the 4 F's. So rewind that. So the 4 F's of grooming are flattery, favoritism, forbidden fruits, and fear. And this is where we have a really strong overlap with your theme of cult trends and patterns within cult systems, because grooming is a perverse form of courtship. And just like courtship between two consenting equal adults, it always starts off sweet. And this is an important part of our conversation, to recognize that the individual who's going to be a potential predator in my family or somebody's family is often going to be the person who is kind and sweet to us and to our child. So as we recognize that each of those stages, those 4 F's, that flattery, favoritism, forbidden fruits, and fear, each of those serves a purpose for the potential predator. But if we recognize, oh, that person is being very complimentary, that person is sending my child lots of, requests for more communication online, or is liking a lot of my child's images or videos online. These are good indicators to us as parents to say, we're going to watch this more closely. We're going to be tuning into it rather than turning away from it.
Yeah, it's like the love bombing stage of kind of cult recruitment, where you're made to feel like, the most amazing and special person on the planet, as a kind of pretense to, the fear, I suppose, which comes a few, there's no really, I was going to say a few weeks later, but there's no timeline really. It comes after the fear that comes a period of time after the love bombing. And when you talk about watching a situation more closely, if you start to recognize the flattery, how far does it go, or how many other signs do you look for before you might confront somebody that you think may be a potential predator, because that is a really scary thing to think about if you kind of misjudge and you get it completely wrong.
I think you're bringing up a wonderful point, and this is something that's going to really help your listeners. So what we have to remember is that predators are picking available prey. Just like in a wild pack of wildebeests, some are more vulnerable than others. So when the lioness comes to attack, they're going to be looking for not the ones who are the strongest or the fittest or have the highest perimeters around them. So what we have to recognize when evaluating situations that we think may be grooming, we need to be curious. We need to bring ourselves closer into that situation and try to get down to what are the facts. Okay, so we've identified that this person is really complimentary to my child or to me as a mom and has shown great interest in my family. Interesting. So I'm also going to be paying attention to, are there indications of that next F, which are favoritism? Because the power of favoritism when it comes to predation is that favoritism isolates a child from their peers. So I don't know if you've ever had the experience of being in a class or being in an environment where there's one or two identified favorites. It often creates a barrier between the other people who are peers of that individual and the individual themselves. It tightens the bond with potentially a teacher, for example, or a coach, because that's the sort of golden child or that's the golden player. So the other children might create a little more space with that individual. So we've got isolation there. And if I'm a parent and I recognize there's somebody who's in our lives who's very complimentary and showing a lot of sweetness and attention, and this person is identifying you as being exceptional or standing out in a sport or a classroom or a religious environment, I'm going to indicate to potentially a supervisor or to an individual who is in charge of that environment and say, I'm curious because I noticed this trend. Again, grooming is a pattern of behavior that is working towards a specific targeted result, which is often attaining gas, which is getting that grooming access and space. Because if they've built enough trust with me as a mom, I'm more likely to say, sure, take them on that camping trip, or sure, you can drive them home alone. So it's important for me to recognize, who do I have within that ecosystem? So we've talked about schools quite a bit. Who are the other individuals within the school system? Is there a co-teacher? Is there a direct supervisor? Is there an assistant principal at the school? Who's the head of the school? Because what I want to do is shed light in these environments rather than closing off communication. And what I often find is that individuals who are dealing with a grooming situation will say, well, I sent an email to the person directly. Do you know how useful an email is to the individual that we're worried about as a potential predator? It's no use to me as a mom if I'm sitting in the stands and you're having this conflict or you're observing this curiosity with a specific coach or a specific instructor, giving your child flattery and favoritism. What's more useful is bringing that conversation out into light. This happens especially when we think about money, gifts, promotions, and special attention. So it's very, very common for predators to give gifts. And we hear this a lot. So looking out for any new shoes, bags, jewelry, anything that looks to be something that you didn't purchase for your child. And that's a great opportunity for us, if we recognize it, to use the public spaces that we have available to us to return that item to the individual in question. Because if I'm attending, let's say, an instruction of my child and I'm watching a practice, and this conversation happens near the stands where I'm sitting, then I get the added benefit of having this insight and this information. If, on the other hand, I, as the parent of the child who's being groomed, am hesitant or fearful or worried about the consequences, then I might just cloister off to the corner and say something quietly, or meet them in their office, or send them a quiet email. However, what we notice and what I recognized when dealing with the predators that I worked with is that they would hop like a frog from lily pad to lily pad. If they started to have some scuttlebutt or people were questioning their intentions with the children, they would move from school to school to school, or from sport to sport to sport, or church to church to church. So it is not uncommon for simply a certain amount of gossip and loud whispers around an individual to deter their pursuit of a given target.
Pose as well, my kind of no conflict personality. Like I don't do well with conflict, so I would be very nervous to accuse somebody incorrectly. But also, when I consider what the consequences are on the flip side of that, which is, my child's safety, of course, there is one that outweighs the other. So I would rather incorrectly accuse somebody of trying to do something than to not say anything at all because of fear of kind of getting it wrong.
Yeah, and it doesn't also have to be you. If you have a head of school or another teacher or a co-instructor or another coach who works alongside this individual, bring up this information. Let them know, hey, this is something that I'm noticing. My child Timmy says that he got this new ball from the coach, and I feel uncomfortable with gift giving. He didn't ask my permission first. We never spoke about whether it was appropriate. There hasn't been a birthday or any sort of event that would have warranted giving a gift. So I just want to put you on notice because, again, you and I are having to rely on adults right now. And the large majority of people who work in environments with children do not want to harm children. So if we know that predators are different, then how do they stand out? They stand out by their behavior. And it's on us to make sure that we have a relationship with the other adults who maybe have children in the program, the other staff members who are working in the environment near our children, to have that sense of community. Again, this is a collective problem. If it's sort of like nits. It's sort of like when, we know that there are certain things we can do to prevent nits from traveling within a classroom. And if we simply say, oh, well, this is only my issue, I'm going to hold on to it, then we don't protect other people from protecting themselves and protecting their families.
You mentioned there something about how it's only, it's a small percentage of people that you'll find in certain settings that are potential groomers. What I struggle with, and I'm not sure if this is just a societal thing, I'm sure it's deeply entrenched, and I'd have to do a lot of introspection to kind of work out really where this comes from. But I mentioned before we hit record that there was a school in our local area that have let one of their staff members go after he was arrested, and then a period of time afterward was charged for having sexually explicit material of children on his devices. So this person had never been convicted of a crime of this nature before. So when you do, over here we call them DBS checks, which is where you'll do if you want to work with children or vulnerable people, you'll have to have a DBS certificate to say that you don't have a criminal record, or these are the things on your criminal record, like speeding, you were, in trouble for driving the wrong way, which is, something that employers might say, no, you can't work with children still. But, it doesn't flag anything that is a worry in terms of grooming and sexual exploitation. What has happened since then is a lot of parents in my sort of circle worried about all male staff members and all male teachers. I know statistically that sexual abuse and coercive control is gendered from the statistics that we have available to us. What do you say to people that have that worry that all male teachers or all men in positions where we are sending our children off to be cared for by other adults, that all of those men might potentially be dangerous?
Well, you've raised a really good point, which is we cannot blanketly know if somebody's a potential predator from their gender, their class, their education, their socioeconomic status, their race. We have to rely on our observations as individuals within that space or within that community. When we look at something like a background check or the system that you have in the UK, you're absolutely right. It's only as good as the reported information. So, for example, in the United States, less than 30% of all child sexual abuse is reported. Of that, more than 50% are thrown out because there's no evidence. He did this, she did this. There's no forensics, there's no evidence. So when we look at the background check system here in the States, that piece of paper is so worthless in terms of recognizing who's a potential predator. That being said, what we need to do is we need to have policies in place at the spaces and environments where we place our children. So, for example, a group like Boy Scouts has actually pivoted a great deal since all of the sexual abuse scandal has come out in their environments, and they have a 2-adult policy. Now, that means that no group can meet, no outing can happen, no child can ever be alone with an adult. Now, I would add to that no adult should work with another adult with children if they've had a romantic relationship with each other. Because we often see, especially with female predators, that they will work alongside a male co-defendant in order to pursue potential targets. And I would also say that those individuals should not be related. Too often in my practice, I experienced that the same individuals would prey on generations within their families. And intra-family abuse, sibling abuse, these are topics that we never discuss. These are very taboo subjects. So the fact that we're even having this conversation is a wonderful start. Your audience has the opportunity to evaluate what are the policies where my child attends school? What are the staff doing to make sure that everything is above board, that not only are children protected and vulnerable individuals, but that the character and the reputation of the adults is also protected. When I teach classes within religious environments here in the Atlanta area, I'm often asked by individuals, why would I bother volunteering with kids when there's such a risk to me individually for having an allegation or being in a situation? And I've said, absolutely, the policies that we're talking about and discussing are twofold. They are protecting you as the adult, because Casey, like you, I want to be in the school environments. I want to be able to go on field trips or overnights with a school or a certain activity. And I want to know that the institution has protected my reputation and has not put me in an environment that puts my reputation at risk. So 2 adults at all times with kids is a very good first start. No closed off spaces. Again, when we think about grooming, we also need access and space to have child sexual abuse. It's that intersection. So what are the available spaces? Maybe the school hasn't even considered what some of their risk factors are. And when it comes to that specific teacher that you're referencing, the tech companies are not mining their devices for child sexual abuse material. It is something that many of them have even come out and said, it's not our business to go into somebody's private device or private cloud storage system to mine for illicit exploitative material. So as far as you and I are concerned, Casey, we have an obligation to make sure that every environment is as safe as possible, including the space of the online world, which many, many children are spending far more hours on alongside their caregivers. But those individuals are also professionals who might work in environments with children. So we need to do our due diligence about not only checking backgrounds, but then evaluating, looking at their references, following up with references, calling to say, would this person be eligible for rehire? Who's to say that that individual hasn't been fired from another job or let go from a volunteer position? This is the sort of work that is on the shoulders of individuals who are hiring in child-serving environments.
Yeah, so much of this is just, it's so familiar to me through conversations that I've had with guests on the show, but also in job roles that I've had previously as a kind of respite and activities coordinator for young carers. So children aged 6 to 18 that look after somebody else at home. So they're already a vulnerable population of people. And when I would take large groups of children out on trips, there were just so many things to consider in terms of like making sure that you were never alone with a child for my benefit and for the benefit of the child as well. But then you'd take some of them swimming, like 6, 7, 8-year-olds who wouldn't really know how to like dress themselves very well. And it would be like really tricky, to try and make sure that you were being appropriate and supportive. And it's a hard balance to find, but it's definitely possible. Then again, I'm a woman, so I might find it a bit easier to feel like I'm, less judged by my caring role for other people's children, because I know my partner talks about how if it's dark and he's walking on the same side of the road as another woman, sometimes he'll cross the road because he just doesn't want to make her feel uncomfortable. And I can't believe that's the world that men live in because of the actions of, other men typically.
That's right. And we have a vested interest in having active fathers in environments where their children spend time. But I will tell you that I'm always curious about individuals who go out of their way to spend more time with children than individuals of their own age. And one of the principles that I talk about in the book, as well as when I speak to groups, is about the seesaw principle or the teeter-totter principle, which is that predators stand out because they do one of two things with minors. They either elevate that minor to the status of a peer, so they talk about emotional problems, employment problems, marital problems, and really discuss things that no child has any business knowing about, as well as sexual content, sexual jokes, sexual material. Or they will relate to a child and they will equip their house with all the games that a child likes. They will even use lingo that a child likes. These are oftentimes those cool teachers who let the kids cuss in the classroom, even though none of the other teachers would expect that. This is getting a little bit more into that forbidden fruits section of grooming, where we notice that for individuals who allow our child to break rules that we have put in place for their safety and well-being is an enormous red flag. Nobody should be allowing our child to drink or smoke or see movies that are not pre-approved by us, because predators, by and large, don't ask for our permission. So whenever we recognize that somebody hasn't checked in with us first, was not clear about what they did with our child or in the space and time they had with our child, if our child reports, oh, well, they said they were going to take us to this G-rated movie, but instead we ended up watching this R-rated movie, that's an enormous amount of information for me as a parent. I now know that you are an untrustworthy adult. And predators typically test the fences, a little bit like Jurassic Park, if you remember that film. that they were sort of testing the fences to find weaknesses. Same is true with potential predators. They're evaluating, did this kid go back and tell their parents? Did I hear from the parent about this? Did the kid somehow avoid telling anyone, kept it a secret? Because predators thrive in silence and secrecy. And if we can build enough shame and guilt in a child, then we could almost guarantee that by the time we get to the fear stage of grooming, we won't have to work that hard to keep them quiet or from telling somebody else, because they will have so much self-loathing that they will typically not go out of their way to tell somebody, which is unfortunately a real truth. And in this country, the age of first disclosure is 52 years old. So if we're relying on individuals to share their story and to come out and let us help and support them, then we're often decades too late to intervene, and we're decades too late to stop a potential predator. And so many survivors, I'm sure that you talk to, as well as the ones I talk to, say, well, I didn't have anybody that I could trust. I didn't have anybody I could talk to. Because again, those predators work so keenly to identify those children who are vulnerable and then isolate them. So our charge with our kids is to help them identify who at school, who at sport, who at your various activities do you trust that you could go to and talk to, because you are away from me as your caregiver. And I want to know that you have a couple of people in every environment that you could go to and talk to if something came up.
Yeah. It's kind of leaning into the digital stuff and the online safety, which I imagine is like a whole day's worth of conversation in itself. That kind of leads me into less of the community strategies and more of the family strategies. So what do you talk about with people you work with when these situations are not happening in sports groups and in schools or in Boy Scouts, but they're actually happening in the family home?
Yeah, that's a really sticky scenario. The most important thing that I teach parents to do is to have really open communication from the get-go. So teaching parents how to use the real words for body parts, because it's not good enough for us to call a female genitalia a cookie, because if my child is with an uncle or with a grandparent and says, somebody touched my cookie, that's not going to serve them. It's actually going to handcuff them. And it's probably going to delay our response as caring adults to intervene. Secondly, we describe and explain the difference between privacy, secrecy, and surprise, because that's a concept that all children can grasp, even young children, especially with birthday parties or different holidays where surprises are always about withholding a certain amount of information for a limited period of time before we experience something joyful and happy. Surprises never end in a negative, disastrous way. I mean, they might go sideways sometimes, but the intent with every surprise is something positive. Privacy can be explained as only a certain amount of people have this information, whether it's your doctor's results, whether it's your report card, whether it's the status of the relationship between mom and dad. These are things that might be private because we don't need to put, for example, the location of the outdoor house key on the side of the highway. That is a good example for kids to understand, yeah, I don't need to tell my friends where my outdoor key is at home. That's private. But secrets are always about harming somebody. They're always about making somebody feel bad or eventually experiencing harm in some way. So my little children, because my last name is Sonoda and starts with an S, they say Sonodas don't keep secrets. And my child from the age of 3 knows that and can say that to friends who say, oh, keep this secret, or this is just a secret. Keep this between you and I. And it's actually been a good education for grandparents and caring adults who say, oh, I'll give you this sweetie, or I'll give you this treat. Don't tell anybody, it's our little secret. But imagine what happens, how a family can change when you say, we don't do secrets. We do surprises and we do privacy, but there's nothing that is secret because you are safe in this environment. You're always believed in this environment. You're always listened to in this environment. We always have time to hear you out in this environment. That really lowers the vulnerability for a potential child. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. Yeah. It's making me think about some of the things that we do here because, I mean, you could give treats like sweets and biscuits and say surprise, which would change it. But my son is always like, can I tell you a secret that you can't tell anyone else? Because he's just learning about, telling secrets.
Yeah.
And I could see how, that could be used as a way to get him not to tell me things. Can I tell you a secret, but you're not allowed to tell anyone else? For him, it's a game, or for him, it's a way like for me and him to have time together. So it's a lot of food for thought, so much food for thought.
And maybe that's private. Like, we're going to keep this private between the two of us. But you're absolutely right, Casey, that it can be weaponized in the wrong hands. And predation thrives on secrecy. So if we know that individuals who have survived atrocities by potential predators and predators, if they have built up shame and guilt and self-loathing, then we're going to start with a foundation within our families that say, we don't do that. We are an open environment. We talk about difficult subjects. We talk about them bluntly and clearly on an age-appropriate level, because that piece of secrecy, and you highlighted it just now in your storytelling, it bonds two individuals. It brings you and your son closer together, and it feels more intimate. And likewise, predators will create secrets and opportunities to form secrecy with a potential target because it isolates that child from their support system. And it makes them think, I can't go to my mom because I went to the R-rated movie, or I drank when I was with Uncle Tom, or I watched that, I picked up that dirty magazine that my aunt left out the last time I went for a sleepover. These are things that predators are so intentionally crafting around a vulnerable child that we need to do our diligence to observe it and to figure out what to recognize. Because, again, grooming is a selective process, but it's also observable. You can observe a child growing in intimacy with another adult, and the cornerstone relationship really needs to be inside the home with a caring adult. Individuals who are living with their two biological parents are the least likely group to be sexually abused inside the home. Individuals who are in foster care, children who are in foster care, are 10 times more likely to be sexually abused. Individuals living in a home with a single dating parent are over 20 times more likely to be sexually abused. So when we think about the in-home risk, we've already discussed how sexual abuse most likely happens where the child lives or where the predator lives. If I'm dating and I'm bringing individuals into my home, the risk for my child goes up exponentially. And this is a conversation that we often run away from. We fear judgment. We fear, consequences of different choices that have been made. And what we need to focus in on is the safety and well-being of children. And if we know that that's a high-risk group, then we need to craft ways that we can make that environment safer. So that's certainly something that I discuss in my book about how we can make the home environment a safer environment. Increased transparency, increased supervision, less substance use, because these are all things that make us less able to recognize predation.
My heart is so heavy thinking about so many children and vulnerable people that just don't have a significant person that is an ally, an advocate, or a protector. Somebody that is there to watch over them and make sure that they are okay. It makes me feel really heavy and It makes me reflect on a lot of conversations that I've had with a lot of guests. And it's just really helping me understand certain decisions that are implemented in certain groups, like when a leader will say that parents are not allowed to spend time with their children because the whole family or however, we're all the parents are all parents to all the children, and the lines really blur, and like children are then kind of raised by slightly older children in really horrible cases of parentification, or they are minded and raised by other parents and other adults because their parents have been sent elsewhere to do things away from their biological children. And there's so many things that are lining up for me. That's just one specific case, but this has really been such an education for me today. And I feel a little bit more at ease, I think.
To say in regards to your earlier comment is that when we go out and about, when we go to school, when we go to sporting activities, we have the opportunity to show up and look up and speak up on the behalf of children who may not have a parent who can be there or be as attentive. And this is why it's so critical that we view child sexual abuse as a collective problem. Because when we rely on other adults, we must also raise the expectation of those adults. We must say, when you're at school, when you're in this activity, you're looking out for your child, but you're also looking out for my child. And to build a community that says, when I go to watch, I'll be looking out for Johnny and I'll be looking out for Tommy. Because even though I'm here to see Stephen, I know that their parents couldn't be here or their babysitter couldn't be here.
Yeah. Well, if I couldn't be somewhere, I would be hoping, as you said, that the other parents or other adults in the area would be looking out for my children in a safe and protective way.
Absolutely. And when we see something that doesn't sit right or that's an outlier of behavior, because most people don't want to harm children, so the people who do behave differently, we must report it. We must move it up the chain of supervisors, employers, bosses, because it is a failure on our part when we don't report. It's a failure on our part not to recognize the grooming, but it's even worse if we don't interrupt the grooming process, which could save a child's life.
When you came onto the call today, we were talking a little bit about some projects that you're involved in that we haven't mentioned yet. So I wondered if you could just let the listeners know before we wrap up today, what are some of the projects that you're involved in? And I would like to end on something hopeful around kind of what we can do as a planet, as a community of parents, as adults, kind of in the world. What can we be leaving this episode on to fill us with hope in terms of working towards the right things?
Yes. So I currently spend my time offering trainings and education. I've had the opportunity to work with a variety of religious groups, as I know is a very big theme of the work that you do on this program. And it's been compelling to me, the diversity and the range of religious groups I've had the opportunity to speak with. And actually, I think that is in and of itself a sign of hope, that these communities, once they're recognizing this abuse has taken place, they are responding with education and information. I also spent the last year writing a guided journal for adult survivors or older teen survivors of grooming and child sexual abuse, because we must do everything in our power to reduce and eliminate the shame and guilt felt by survivors of child sexual abuse. The predators were already identifying you from way earlier on in the process, and so many therapists are not trained in understanding grooming, and many people, even who are in mental health services, fail to even share that sexual abuse is a part of their history. So this is a discrete way that people can address what grooming actually looked like in their own personal histories. I think when we're looking at the optimism going forward, we have just spent this whole time discussing this topic that a decade ago or back in the 90s, we never would have spent this much time talking about. So your audience has the opportunity to listen today, to share it, to learn more and get educated, and then implement these things. And if you recognize anything that looks out of order or strange, then speak up, because the worst thing you can do is offend an adult to protect a child. And that is on us as the adults. And I know that because it's in the air in our conversations and our dialogues, individuals are being found for acting inappropriately with children, and communities are putting themselves in a position to be more ready. Just like with families, we don't need paranoia. We need preparation. And my book is hopefully a sign that we're moving in the right direction to educate adults, because we can eliminate up to 90% of all child sexual abuse if we just know what to look for.
Is great. That is great. I've learned so much just in our conversation today. Anna Sonoda, a licensed clinical social worker and author of Duck Groom, Understanding How a Child Becomes a Target. I will make sure that I put links in the episode description to copies of your book, so that if listeners are interested, they can go and grab themselves a copy. Is your journal released yet, or will you send us news of its publication date?
It is released. It came out in September.
Congratulations, that's amazing. So I'll also make sure to put links to the journal in the episode description, as well as Duck Groom, the book itself. And thank you so much for your time today, Anna. Your work is incredible. I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's been uncomfortable, but for the right reasons, I think. We need to be having more of these conversations in order to keep ourselves, our families, and our communities safe, or safer, at least. So thank you so much for your time today.
Yes, thank you, Casey, for making time for this really important conversation and all the work that you do. I know that together, as a collective community of caring adults, we can protect children.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Anna. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Casey.